So our theme today is about how higher team trust and relationships using EQ influence. And I would like to explain what EQ influence is all about. It's really the culmination of a 20-year journey for me. And it all started in sort of around 2000. And really in my upbringing, I would say that I was emotionally dysfunctional. And this was highlighted for me when one day, I remember at 16, my mum said to me, "Gary, you're so selfish." And it stuck with me because I didn't actually know what the word selfish meant, which was a bit shocking, really. But I not only didn't know what selfish meant, I also really wasn't connecting any emotion to that, what impact that was having on me. Now, this is not a decry for my mum. Hopefully you can see her on the slide deck now. My mum is ace, and she did an amazing job in bringing us up. But as a single parent, she couldn't cover every angle. And part of that responsibility with how I work with emotional intelligence, of course, is my own responsibility. Now, I would say that I was emotionally dysfunctional right up until I got married. Here's Lou, my wife, our young family. As you can see, it's a number of years ago. I've got a little bit more salt and pepper since then. But since then, I've had a masterclass in emotional intelligence. I think my family have taught me more than any environment or situation that I've been in. But it's certainly been an adventure over those 20 years. And now that I'm on rung 2 of the ladder, I'd like to share some of those secrets with you today. I'd like to pose a question to you about your own emotional intelligence. We're all on that learning journey, and we're all picking things up as we go. Sometimes we learn it the hard way. Hopefully today we can accelerate some of that learning. Emotional intelligence for me is very much about the color that is brought in life, the richness, the depth, and the rhythm. Now, when we look at emotional intelligence and we measure it, we call that emotional quotient. EQ or EQI is the measure that we use. An EQ influence, as I mentioned at the start, is something that has been a culmination of my 20 years working in this particular area. Now, EQ influence for me is about EQ being the measure of emotional intelligence, and the influence is about what do I do with that measure of emotional intelligence? How do I use it for my own development and how I want to work, both personally and professionally, and how I influence others? A lot of the work that we do is with leaders, not only in the UK, Europe, but around the world. And we all know that working with others is what we all aim for. And one of the key things with that is developing high trust relationships, which is what we're about today. And we all know that there's nothing better than a great relationship. Now, as I mentioned, we're all on this journey, this EQ journey. And maybe we know what it looks like, and maybe we have some clarity about how it works. I'd like to share some thoughts with you today about how you can deepen that experience. I liken it to our friendships that we have in our life. Think of somebody that you're really close to. Maybe they look like this person here. In the distance, we can see that there is somebody. Now, that person I know very personally. You would recognize them. As they get closer, you might say, well, I can see that it looks like it might be a man. But it's only as we get up close and personal that we can see who that person is and what they might be about. And this is the same with our emotional intelligence behaviors. How well do we know these behaviors? This person here has a name. He's called Anthony. He also has things that are good about him and things that sometimes are less good about him. I know that because I'm a personal friend of Anthony. My challenge to you is, do you know your emotional intelligence behaviors at the same kind of depth? Do you know the names of what they're called? Do you know when they feel good and when they feel like they're not being good to you? Because if you aren't that well aligned with them or that friendly with them, then we have that gap of self-awareness. And that's a big part of what EQ influence is all about. Now, as I mentioned before, there is nothing better than a great relationship. And maybe from this image, you can see Anthony and I in one of our favorite places. And maybe you can sense something of the emotion in this picture. For me, it fills my heart with joy. And maybe you can see some of that, sense some of that. Hopefully that little introduction just gives you that flavor around what emotional intelligence is all about and how we can use that. We are now going to go on to some of the work in the workbook, so please follow that along with us as you will. Starting at the beginning here, these are the three kind of key things that we're going to look at. But before we dive into the detail of it, I'd like to challenge you, challenge us, challenge me about how are we being in this season? We're in lockdown 3 in the UK. And I want to ask, how are you looking after you personally? And how are you looking after others as a leader in your organizations? There's one thing that we all have in common, and that's we're all learners today. I'm learning something, even as I prepare and talk this. It embeds new information for me. What you will share with us will bring more learning. But I'd invite you to think about your EQ influence and how that is working with and for others. Now, if your world is anything like mine, before this pandemic came through, I was busy. I think sometimes, certainly the feedback that we're getting from organizations, we're even busier now. We're even feeling it more. The blur is starting to come back. I hear about people being on Zoom for 8 hours solid and just, getting up for a toilet break or a quick coffee break. Now, when I ask people, how are they doing? People often say to me, well, I'm fine, or I'm okay. And, in emotional intelligence terms, that doesn't mean anything. And I think in this digital world, this makes it much harder. I did a LinkedIn survey recently and asked for descriptors of how people feel when they're busy and what does that look like. And as you can appreciate, we got some positive and some negative descriptions. I'd like to share some of those with you. Some people said that when they're busy, they're excited and invigorated, they're engaged, they're flying, they're living the dream, they're having fun, they're making that difference. And one of the best ones I liked was, I've got lots of plates spinning. Thankfully, I'm a champion plate spinner. The negative ones were things like hassled, snowed under, I'm drowning, not waving. I can't wait for a day off. Can't wait for a holiday. I'm oversubscribed or rammed. And one of my favorites, I'm wearing many hats. Hang on, let me remember which one I'm wearing. And these answers all relate to how people are being, but it doesn't tell me about actually what's going on for them, what's going on for people. Now, in the workbook on page 3, there is an opportunity for you to measure interpersonal relationship when we look at it in emotional intelligence terms. Now, this is a quick measure. Please feel free to take some time now or later on to do that. Now, the information at the bottom is probably the most important bit wherever you rate this particular subscale. We have the high scoring and the affective area, which would all relate to elements of that. And then we have what we call the cost of high, where when we're on autopilot and we're in that busyness, that it could have negative impact. And maybe you can relate to some aspects of some of the things that are highlighted there. And the lower scoring areas, sometimes we're less practiced at some of these things. Some of the clients that we're working with currently are inviting us back into their workplaces and virtual workshops to look at how we transition back into that interpersonal working in a face-to-face environment. Now, you don't need me to tell you that one of life's great privileges is a one-to-one conversation. And when we talk about higher team trust, one-to-ones are absolutely vital. Now, this place here is a place I used to live many years ago. And it was a place where a one-to-one took place in my early career that changed my life forever. I'd ended up drifting into this place. This is Upper Teesdale. And if you want somewhere to staycation in the UK, I highly recommend this place. It was once marketed as England's last wilderness, and it's still true. It's a beautiful place. In that one-to-one, this person happened to be Anthony that I showed you earlier. We were driving up the valley and he said, I want you to join my team. I want you to come and join the team, and I want you to climb your own mountain. And he wasn't just asking me to physically climb a mountain, he was asking me to climb a mountain in mindset, behavior, and development. And I chose to follow that route with Anthony, and it was a complete adventure. It changed my life, not just professionally, but personally too. It's where I first got married and I met Lou as well. So it had an impact in all areas of our life. Now, we know about one-to-ones. We know the impact that they can have a one-to-one conversation. And the reason that I shared part of my personal story with you is because your stories are powerful. I didn't share my story to big me up. I shared it with you to show the impact that it can have. You're never going to forget that image of that isolated farmhouse and my one-to-one conversation. It will stick with you, especially if you see a similar image. And I would encourage you to find your stories and start telling them. I know a lot of you will already be storytellers, but it is about those one-to-one meaningful conversations. And your stories will challenge and inspire others. It will encourage them to share something about their own story. Dr. Penny Pullen, a friend and a colleague of mine, a virtual leadership expert, says that in this environment, in the virtual world, we need to have that clarity, connection, and collaboration. And stories are a great way of providing that. A powerful way of engaging virtually. Now, you might ask, when should I share my stories? Well, it's about encouraging others. It's about inspiring others. We don't need to be an extrovert to be an inspiration. I find that introverted people often have very powerful stories that move me more than the pizzazz sometimes that we see on things like TED Talks. Sharing a personal story is a great way to share vulnerability, and we'll talk about this in a second. It also gives permission for other people to share. It gives them that invitation to share what might be going on for them. I like to share when I mess up or when things go wrong, because that helps build that trust, that higher team trust that we're talking about. And it also confirms that when other people mess up, they're not alone. Now, when we talk about one-to-one, it's about questions. And on page 4 of the workbook, we have highlighted for you a number of approaches that you can take with questions. One of the key areas that I've developed in the coaching that we've been doing is encouraging people to approach conversations with short, no agenda questions. Things like, how's your world? I'm not asking about work. I'm not asking about personal life. I'm asking about your world. It could engage both of those. And that encouragement to go that little bit deeper. I really like the work by Michael Bungay Stanier. If you've not heard about Michael's work, here are some of the books that he's written. I would highly encourage you to read his work. It's great content, and he shares it really magnanimously. Now, when I met with Michael a number of years ago and shared a stage with him, he shared one of his key things with me, which is his or question, and what else? And I use that all the time when I'm facilitating and coaching and developing relationships. What else is important for you? Is there anything else that you want to share? And you can just keep going with that sharing. I think what's really important as well is about sharing joys. It talks about that on page 4 of the workbook. I think we've got out of the habit of sharing joys in this environment. We're all about work at the minute, and those opportunities to celebrate together the achievements that we're doing are starting to show their cracks in teams and relationships. And it's really important that we pick that up. There is also the unpack approach, which is about getting underneath something, getting into the behavior and the understanding about what's going on for people. I was recently coaching a leader. He's a senior leader in a higher education environment, and he looks after a team, a growing team, and he's currently delivering £30 million worth of projects in this particular environment. And he shared with me the difficulty that he had in engaging with his 2 sons. He's developing his team relationships, but it was his 2 sons that he was struggling with the most. And I challenged him and I said, share that you're having coaching about how you develop relationships, and invite your sons to go on a journey with you. And I challenged him to ask his sons to help him learn to grow. And he's taken this challenge to heart and taken it back. And it's been an absolute game changer. It's really shifted the focus of where learning is. And at the bottom of page 4, I encourage leaders not to be readers, but to be learners. Consume understanding. Your attention today is hugely valuable, and we appreciate you taking the time to spend it with us. Hopefully we're going to bring some real value as we get going. But certainly that opportunity with being learners, knowing when that I'm the learning leader and also when I'm the leader of learning, because we need to be both of those things. All right, let us move on then. Let us look at page 5. I wanted to make some connection with mental health and well-being, and a word that is used regularly around resilience and how emotional intelligence feeds into this. These are elements and behaviors that are all in the EQI model: self-regard, self-actualization, flexibility, stress tolerance, and optimism. And in the work that we've been developing with many organizations is building that resilience with people, not only just in this environment and season that we've been going through, but in real terms, especially with emerging leaders. Now, when we talk about emotional intelligence, we often might not clarify about what it brings and the hard stuff that it brings. So we talk about, confidence, we talk about self-belief. Well, that is wrapped up in emotional intelligence around self-regard, motivation and purpose with self-actualization. We're talking about interpersonal relationship, how we flex and adapt and manage with what life throws at us, how we cope with that, what I call the cope ability with stress tolerance. And leaders are dealers in hope. Hope is embedded in optimism. I work with many leaders, and optimism is not a key part of their makeup often at the start. They're more realist than optimist. They often state the difficulty and the challenge with doing something rather than that creative hope of how to overcome something. So EQI and emotional intelligence brings a lot to that whole area around resilience and well-being. Back to the one-to-one conversation, that coaching conversation, that trust building, that building of empathy, which, by the way, I challenge that statement around being in somebody else's shoes. That doesn't resonate for me personally. For me, authentic empathy is about feeling with somebody, being with them on the journey, not judging them, not telling them what the solution needs to be, but feeling with them. That unpack approach will help you do that. Leaders that I work with often find themselves too narrow and too shallow. They don't get into those really hearty questions. They struggle with holding people to account. They often don't affirm and encourage people at the right level. And they're the gaps in some of those relationships. If we want people to change, especially mindset as well as behavior, then we have to engage with them in a motive way. We need to engage them in the heart. That motive is their desire to do or say something, or to change something. And then we want the action with the motive as well. We want a movement from A to B. We want a shift in what's going on. And right now that shift is a challenge to bring for some leaders. I call it motive action. So we want motivation, that's something, but motive with action is something else. As we engage with those one-to-one and team conversations, then we get the real depth and meaning out of that. Now, I'd like to just bring back that learning leader approach and inviting you to engage with people and asking them some of those key questions about what moves you, what motivates you, what are you learning, what do you want to learn, what are you inspired about, what motivates you to make that change or not to make that change. And there's a lot of ways that we can work out and plan how we can do that. Here's a personal story. You've met Ollie. Actually, Ollie, looking at this picture, it's looking a little bit out of date. I think you've aged at least a year since then. Not that anyone would notice, of course.
A long year.
Yeah. Now, I asked Ollie this question a little while ago, what genuinely motivates you? And it was really interesting what happened, because I asked him this point when we've been working together for a couple of years. And one of the surprises was, for both of us, he wasn't able to answer it straight away. Now, Ollie is a self-aware young man, and he has good clarity, but he felt he wanted to take that away and think about it. So he did do, and a number of days later, he came back to me and he shared with me the answer. And it took us both by surprise again. Surprise for Ollie, because on his reflection, he didn't think he would get where he got to, and it surprised me as well. And it's this: Ollie loves, and at his heart, he loves to educate and support people. And for those of you that are clients of ours, you will have experienced that, because we get feedback around that all the time. He loves to have a feeling of usefulness, and that ability to share that usefulness. And he has real gratitude in his heart towards the people who want to learn, that are connected to him. So really, at his heart, he loves to help others and be the best that they can. He's an educator in that way. And I didn't know that. And we've been engaging with that as Ollie has become EQI certified. So it is interesting what can occur when you engage with understanding what motivates people. It shifted our focus for Ollie on our team. But it leads us into the next point very easily, which is around the trust equation. Now, you might have read about this work in the book, The Trust Equation. I'm not going to go through it all in great detail, but this is on page 7 of the workbook. And there's some kind of headline themes around what this is all about. But the bit I want to zone in with here is intimacy. This is not a word that we often hear in a professional context. Yet if you engage with real trust, intimacy is very much a part of it. Now, you can have a quick look at the top couple of chapters in the workbook to just kind of have a scan read of that. But essentially, that trust equation is talking about how we know, like, and trust people. And that's often where we aspire to be. We all want to be known, liked, and trusted. We know about reliability. The intimacy is about emotional connectedness. It's about how personal people feel comfortable sharing with you. What is their safety in sharing? And as Mark has already highlighted, for some people in the virtual world, there has been a safer space for being able to do that. It's also about people knowing that you've got their back. And sometimes in that virtual context, that's more difficult to demonstrate. And not too much of the S, the self-orientation, i.e. I'm just out for me and I'm less out for the people that I work with and for. I'd like to talk to you about a book that I found. It's not a usual business book, by the way. It's called The Invisible String. It's by Patrice Karst, and it's a fabulous children's book. And it tells the story of these two children and their mum. And it starts off by setting the scene of it's a stormy night and the kids have gone to bed and they're woken up by a clap of thunder and they're scared. They run to mum, help us. And she talks about how we're always connected, how we always have this invisible string that connects us together, no matter where we are in life or in the world. And I think it's a beautifully told tale. And I picked it up. I can't remember how I found it now. But for me, when we talk about higher trust and higher team trust, really it's the invisible string of interpersonal relationship. And on page 9, you'll see those areas that I've highlighted that I think are those invisible strings of page 8, sorry, of interpersonal relationships. Patience. By the way, frustrated as a word is the most meaningless word when we're talking about emotional intelligence. It has no meaning, it is beige, it is empty, and yet it is the most commonly used descriptor of how I'm feeling. I'm frustrated about that. That frustrates me. Leaders that I work with, they're banned in saying it. I encourage them to raise a flag in their head and say to themselves, I'm being unclear when I use the word frustrated. I'm not being clear to myself or to others. That truth, engaging with that openness. Courtesy, ensuring that it is never missed. Forgiveness, that's a real intimate statement in a professional context. There is a simple human need, and that is to be appreciated. We all need that for what we do and what we bring, who we are. Simone Weil said, attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. We need that balance of how we bring ourselves to the team, but we also need to bring everyone together in that team. And I think the invisible string is really what it's all about. Let me throw something else that you may well have heard of previously, and this is the work of Patrick Lencioni. If you haven't heard of Patrick's work, he's written a number of excellent New York bestsellers, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, which they've now rebranded into the 5 Cohesive Behaviors of a Team. I think Patrick realized after a bit of time that maybe dysfunctional focus was a bit too strong, and it is about that cohesiveness and that real building of intimacy in the trust equation there. But what I like about this model, apart from, I would describe it as a simplified model, not a simple model, because there's great depth to it. But it's something that leaders can use on a day-to-day basis. They remember it and it works really well. What Lencioni talks about with trust is around that vulnerability, which I think Austin had mentioned in the chat there, which links to the intimacy. And many of us might have heard of or read around the work of Brené Brown and other people around this element of vulnerability and this closeness and intimacy that Helen was talking about. But Patrick Lencioni talks about vulnerability-based trust, how we share and connect with each other around those weaknesses and skill deficiencies. Sharing a personal story, for me, I share my my gaps, my deficiencies with my team, and it's really interesting what happens. They actually help me. They actually give me feedback when it's going wrong. They've actually got my back, and it actually makes us more connected together and more productive in what we do, because it covers me when I get things wrong. And by the way, I get things wrong fairly regular. I would say several times a day. So, you know, we're all in that place of making mistakes and how we confess those. We've worked for people or with people that either struggle to or will refuse to actually say sorry or own up to actually what's gone wrong. We all have challenges around how we work interpersonally and how we build that trust. But here's one with emotional intelligence around fear. That's a core emotion that maybe we don't really talk about, but I would suggest that that is occurring every day in every office, everywhere around the world. Anxiety is an element of fear, and if we are not experiencing that with ourselves or other people around us, we are at the minute, aren't we? In a big way, and that has a root of fear in there. So we've got some strong emotions that are going on for people, even if we struggle to articulate those. On that page 10 of your workbook, we've put there from Patrick's work around five ways how you can build that trust. And as a learning leader or a leader of learning, I'd encourage you and your clients to practice this and be the role model in demonstrating this. A reflective question for you, I guess, might be around, what does this mean for you as a leader in the environment where you're leading? And equally as important, what does it mean for your self-leadership, and how are you looking after you in all of this? We're going to just jump into another element of building trust, and this is a challenge for leaders. It's a key element within emotional intelligence around self-actualization. On page 12 of the workbook, there is again a quick reflection around how this might work for you. Now, it's really interesting that I would say 90% of leaders score high in self-actualization. It is about what they drive and what they deliver, the purpose that they bring, and often the passion that is really important for them. But look at some of those cost of highs at the bottom of page 12. These are common ways that self-actualization can have a negative impact on relationships and on individuals. And things like being self-critical is probably one of the common ones. Being hard on myself and measuring other people too harshly as well can be a common area. So when we think about interpersonal relationship, our own drive and determination to achieve and deliver great work can be actually an element that can have a negative impact on that. So a useful reflection in when we look at behavior, what impacts interpersonal relationship? And this leads us into the last little section of our webinar today, our masterclass. And this is the sharing of a model that we've developed over a number of years now that we call the TPR model. It's a very technical model, and that stands for task, process, and relationships. We all know and love the kind of action-centered leadership models of decades gone by that have really created the foundation for these kind of models. And then we've added a fourth element around the strategic. Now, on page 14 of the workbook, you've got an opportunity to do some self-reflection. Now, you don't have to do it now, but it would be great to have a bit of a quick feel. In the top left-hand corner of page 14, there is an opportunity for you to put a number in the current box, a percentage. If you think about each of these four elements of doing stuff, i.e. the task, improving and developing how you do the stuff, i.e. process, how you work with investing in other people in the relationships. And I'm not talking about a meeting here, I'm talking about one-to-one specific enhancing of relationship, bringing a higher trust relationship, and then time you would spend on that strategic element of your role. If you were going to take a typical week or an untypical week and split 100% across those four key areas of task, process, relationship, and strategy or strategic, what would your split look like right now? How much of your 100% is on task? How much of your 100% would you put on process? How much of it is in relationship? How much of it is in strategic? But hopefully that quick reflection gives you some momentary thought and reflection around, how am I spending my time? How important are each of these areas? It's not uncommon that task takes the majority of our time, task and process together, which means that relationship gets shrinked. It gets smaller. If I do this with this senior leadership team, it's not unusual that it is around that 60, 70, 80% that people are in the task, and only 5 or 10% might be in that relationship circle. And the idea with this reflection is then, well, you can then put down, well, what are those elements? You can take that reflection further. And as a leader or a person who might support leaders, it's not unusual that a leader will be carrying something that somebody else should be carrying or delivering. And how do you want this to be in the future? You know, this is a really apt reflection right now. We're coming out in the UK of some of our COVID lockdowns. We're going to be going back into workplaces, going back to face-to-face learning. What does this need to be as we come out of this? You know that it's going to need that more relationship focus. We've got to engage with understanding what's going on for people. So take this away and use some of these key reflective questions and using them with the people that you work with as well, around how this balance works for us. Nobody has the right answer, and it's important that we all take an opportunity to reflect with these key elements, what we would call the big rocks in our jar. You might have heard of that story previously, that the big rocks are the really important things: family, home life, how we work, not taking work home, so work-life balance. And unless we get those big rocks aligned in our space, we're not going to have room for some of the other things in how that works. Great stuff. Well, my encouragement to you as you think about the people that you work with, the people that you might be leading, or the people that you might coach who lead others, have that engagement with what is working for them, how they get into that development of deeper relationships, how they build that intimacy, that vulnerability, that openness, that trust that makes relationships take on a whole different perspective and enable us to achieve amazing things, crazy things. That story I was sharing right back at the beginning with Anthony and the journey that we've been on, it's been quite an adventure. And it hasn't always been easy, but what has set it apart has been the meaningfulness of the relationship, because that has carried us over when it hasn't been in that healthy place. My final thoughts as we come to a close are around how you're developing you. I always encourage leaders to start with themselves. This is often an area that we neglect the most. And I encourage you to take some protected offline time. There is a template for this in the workbook, at the back of the workbook, and feel free to connect with us and ask any other questions around this. But this is about how you look after you. And I encourage you to take a long coffee with yourself. I love this picture. I love coffee. I don't drink it quite this big. I think this would be quite a difficult one to drink. But, you know, take time out to reflect with what are those things that are really important for you? How am I getting to know my behaviors as friends? And I'm a big advocate of the aggregation of marginal gain, that what's that one thing that's going to make a key difference. So I'd encourage you at the close of this masterclass is don't just jump on to the next thing. Just take a couple of minutes, 5 minutes maybe, and just free write some thoughts on what's really stood out for you, because you'll capture something significant and meaningful that you can implement today and carry forward. It's been a joy and a delight to spend some time with you today, and thank you for choosing to spend that with us. Thank you.